now being in this great place, the Grand Egyptian Museum, which is under construction. We're highlighting some of the pioneering aspects of the Egyptian civilization, and for our surprise, the Egyptians knew diplomacy, and they practiced it with other countries of the world. The Egyptian empire was consolidated through diplomacy with the leaders of other peoples. And here to talk to us more about diplomacy, the role of women, and everything else about the pharaohs is Bassem Shamma, the Egyptology researcher. Hello, Mr. Bassem.
Hello, and thank you for having me.
Hello, Mr. Shamma.
Hello.
Dr. Shamma. Let us first talk about the diplomacy in the ancient Egypt. Did they really realize or acknowledge the importance of diplomacy? And how was that important in consolidating the government back then at that time?
The term diplomacy and the term diplomat, when you mention it, you don't often get this impression that it happened a long time ago. It's a very modern word if compared to thousands of years BC. But indeed, our grandpas knew diplomacy. I wouldn't be exaggerating if I said they actually set the very foundation of the idea of diplomats, sending people, the concept of sending people from a place to another foreign place, if you like, to get to know them, to get to understand more about them, to learn their language sometimes, and vice versa, bringing people from outside the Egyptian kingdom to live in the court of the king and to learn the language of the Egyptians. They were the first people to set the idea of sending representatives from Egypt to talk to people outside. There was also what we knew about the language of diplomacy in the world at that time, the known world at that time. And as today English is, if you like, the language of diplomacy around the world, in ancient Egypt there was also a writing which is the cuneiform or the mesmeric, which took shapes that everybody knew, and we learned about that when there was a diplomat relationship between Egypt, for example, ancient Egypt and the Hittites. For example, we knew that the messages were sent back and forth in the days of Akhenaten, for example, the very famous Amarna letters. The Amarna letters were not letters on paper. They were actually carved on then baked mud and baked stone, and then it became the well-known Amarna letter. But there were no hieroglyphs on Amarna letter. There were no demotics. It was cuneiform. So from these letters and from these relationships between us and other kingdoms, if you like, we knew that cuneiform was the language and the script that was used by everybody. So yes, indeed, that helped a great deal in how the governments dealt with other governments as well. Treaties were made between kingdoms.
Yeah, the friends of Egypt or the allies of Egypt back then for the pharaohs.
Allies and if you like, enemies who became allies. It is pretty amazing to learn, for example, about the Hittites, the Hatti, or if you like, the Hatti in the ancient script. The Hatti or the Hittites were people very strong, very able, and they had the most amazing kingdom. If you like, Anatolia, south of Turkey, if you like, northern Syria, Qadish, the famous Battle of Qadish that we all learn about and we all know about, depicted on many scenes on the temples like Luxor Temple, Ramesseum. All those battles, all those years of fighting between the Hittites and the Egyptians were not only in the days of Ramesses II, but also in the days of his father, Seti. And we learned, for our greatest amazement, that there was peace treaties. And if you mention diplomacy, you mention peace treaties, because that's when diplomacy works. And we learned that those peace treaties were broken sometimes, especially when it happened between the time of Seti and his son Ramses. So Ramses II had this amazing fight against the Hittites, which ended up by Ramesses telling us in one of the scripts that here comes the representatives of the Hittites, here are the diplomats, the messengers he called them, and those messengers are coming with a plate of silver, and carved on this plate of silver a request of peace. So peace was carved on silver. And we all asked ourselves the question that you're all asking now, is why on silver, why not on gold? Since gold is gold.
Why not a stone?
Why not stone,
As
indeed?
usual.
Obviously, why not stone? Because silver is more precious,
More valuable,
or
yeah.
gold is more precious. But why silver and not gold? Well, this is because silver for the Egyptians were more expensive, or was more expensive than gold. It was more precious than gold. So it seems that the Hittites worked diplomacy in the correct form by sending something that they knew is precious for the Egyptians, and they requested for peace. Now, it's interesting because diplomatic-wise, if you like, you want to ask yourself a question. Did the Egyptians ask for the treaty, for the peace treaty, which gives you the impression that they were defeated? Or did the Hittites ask? The initiative, exactly. And of course, all historians were going, okay, maybe Ramses II is becoming a little bit more diplomatically correct by telling that the Hittites are asking for peace because I'm the victorious king. Or was it that the Hittites won the Battle of Kadesh and Ramesses is telling us a story to save his face, if you like, yes. And that is something that's well known in politics. People are writing...
Throughout history, in every civilization.
Yeah. And you well know that history is written by the triumphant all the time. Anyway, so the question is, we want a peace treaty. And a peace treaty was done, it was carved, the terms are there, we know all about it, and it's carved on stone in the temples of Karnak, and the terms of this peace, if this is not diplomacy at its best, you don't know what's diplomacy. One of the most amazing terms of this peace treaty between the Egyptians and Hittites is that if anybody attacked Egypt, anybody, any enemy, any external power invaded Egypt, it is for the Hittites to come and lend a hand to the Egyptians. And vice versa, if somebody attacked Hittites or Hattusi or Khati, then Egyptian army have to go and lend a hand and save the day for the Hittites. So yesterday's enemies are today's friends.
Right, Dr. Shabmia, tell us about the other forms of diplomacy other than those treaties. There were other forms that they were very popular. The pharaohs were very popular with forms of diplomacy.
That's very true. You are right. And other forms of diplomacy was summarized in the attempt of the Egyptians asking the foreign kingdoms. You know, there were kingdoms around like the Assyrians, like the Southerners, like the Kushites in the beautiful south, like the Wawat. All those are groups of very able people, and they formed civilizations. We have the Western Desert people like the Meshwesh tribes. They were foes. They were very important foes to the Egyptians, and they were quite a huge headache to the Egyptians because they were very able tribes. We have the Sea people, especially in the days of Ramesses III, and the Sea people were very strong, fleet sea people, enemy of the Egyptians. So when the Egyptians, and then all of a sudden we know that the Egyptians let the Sea people live in the Delta. And hello, this is your nemesis, this is the greatest enemy. And then all of a sudden you find groups of foreigners living in the Delta, and those foreigners were enemies in a very short interval of time. So it seems that those treaties were struck and they were invited in to live among the Egyptians. Also, maybe they were strong enough in some times, in some periods of their time, that the Egyptians thought that if they were invited into the Delta and made them live among the society, maybe work for the king or with the king, then this is going to protect him against the attacks of these people. We learned, the other form that we learned is that the Egyptians used to invite the sons and the daughters of those foreign kingdoms to live in the court, to learn about the Egyptians. And maybe that is the first form of ambassadors, because those young guys and young girls, when they're going to grow up, they're going to be well acquainted with hieroglyphs, well acquainted with Demotic, language of the people, language of the commoners. They will be very well acquainted with the religion, with the cult of the country. At the same time, they know the language of their kingdom, let's say Hittite language, or Assyrian, or Akkadian, or Phoenician, or Libyan, if you like, and know also the traditions. So now you have the best of the two worlds, and the two worlds now are friends. So that is probably what you would like to call nowadays an ambassador. Also, kings used to send ambassadors in form of viceroys, in form of viziers, in form of deputies, if you like. Same idea of the wali later on in the Ottoman times. In the Ottoman times, there were the wali of Egypt, the wali of the Ottoman Empire. And from there, we knew, for example, that Ramesses II sent a representative in Nubia. And this representative of the king in Nubia became not only an ambassador and not only a viceroy or a wali or even a deputy of the king, he became the tongue of the king in this place. He became the mouth of the king in this place. And that's why we have titles in ancient. We have a title for the well-known Ham Iyuno, and we are not far away from his achievement, from the achievement of Ham Iyuno. He is the engineer, he's the architect of the pyramid of Khufu. One of his titles, besides being the genius architect of the Great Pyramid, one of his titles was him who is the mouth of the people of Piayi. Piayi is a place near Dusuk, Kafr Sheikh. So that title till today is still to be explained. But it was he who talks with the tongue of the people. Maybe perhaps that is another form of somebody who's representing a group of people in a place.
So was there a time for the ancient Egyptians that diplomacy was at its peak, or maybe just got a little bit weaker during at times? What were the times of the strong diplomatic ties with other countries and vice versa?
The strongest of all, I think personally, from my personal modest point of view, was in the days of Amenhotep III, who is the most well-known. If you would like to put a king to summarize for you the Egyptian kingdom, the ancient Egyptian, you would like to put Amenhotep III. He's the most amazing man. He was the founder of the temple of Luxor. He is the owner of the Colossi, who then became the Colossi of Memnon in the west bank of Luxor. He's the most amazing king. He was married to the most gorgeous lady ever, Queen Tai, who I believe was the most good-looking. Definitely forget Cleopatra. Definitely, because she was a very unattractive lady, looking-wise. Forget about Nefertiti. Don't forget about Queen Tai. She's the lady of wisdom, smart lady, very, very strong politically, and also an amazing relationship with the other. So the relationship between Egypt and the kingdoms was great, to the point. I'll tell you why I chose this king to be the peak of diplomacy. A message was sent by a king of one of the kingdoms of Asia, and they were at their peak as well. What was the sentence that was sent in the message? You will be amazed. My brother, he has a